Usually when the mainstream media tells the story of Jeffrey Epstein, they begin in the year 1991, the year that Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein supposedly first met. They completely ignore the ties that the two have to intelligence agencies like the Mossad, and often they don't name people who were named as abusers by the victims, such as Prince Andrews and Alan Dershowitz. Essentially, they tried to paint a picture of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell as lone abusers who are not part of a larger network. The same way how after the assassination of JFK, they tried to paint Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone nut. But, as most of you know, the network that Jeffrey Epstein was a part of was much larger than just him and Ghislaine. And not only was the network much larger than the two of them, but it goes back way before Jeffrey Epstein was ever involved in the picture. In fact, when we are looking at the origins of the Epstein case, it takes us all the way back to the years of American Prohibition, and to a Canadian businessman turned bootlegger, Samuel Bronfman. Not long before American Prohibition, there was Canadian Prohibition, and this is where Samuel Bronfman got his start in the criminal underworld. He forged ties with those in the American mob to help smuggle alcohol into Canada, which he would then sell at his parents' chain of hotels. But not long after Canada repealed its prohibition, America began a prohibition of its own. And this is when Bronfman began to supply people in the American mob with alcohol. People like Mayor Lansky and Lucky Luciano, the two of which would go on to form the National Crime Syndicate, a merger between Jewish mobs and Italian mobs. Bronfman was an essential part of the National Crime Syndicate's bootlegging operations, and an essential part of Bronfman's bootlegging operations was a man by the name of Louis Rosenstiel. While Bronfman was relatively conservative in his social life, the same could not be said about Rosenstiel, who was a bisexual philanderer who married 5 times. His fourth wife, Susan Kaufman, said during divorce proceedings that he would host extravagant parties where he would supply friends with, quote, boy prostitutes. And she said that attendees would include government officials and high-profile figures in organized crime. She even said that she saw FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover in drag at one of these parties. And let me mind you, she is not the first person to say that they had seen Hoover's penchant for wearing drag. And there are 2 sources independent of Kaufman who say this. And Kaufman said that not only did these parties exist, but that they were bugged and that the audio recordings were taken for the purpose of blackmail. While Bronfman and Rosenstiel would go on to have a complicated relationship, to say the least, which would ultimately result in the two becoming competitors with one another in the liquor industry, there is one thing that they always held in common, and that was a close personal relationship with the infamous mobster Mayor Lansky. Mayor Lansky is one of the most high-profile members in the entire history of American organized crime, and for someone who was such a powerful mobster, he is the only one to have never served a day in jail. And the reason for this is almost undoubtedly his ties to a multitude of intelligence agencies. He had ties both to the CIA through counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton, who used Lansky and his mob in one of many failed attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro, as well as through naval intelligence in what was known as Operation Underworld. Lansky also had ties to Israeli intelligence, specifically the high-level Mossad agent and arms procurer Tiber Rosenbaum. Rosenbaum would launder Lansky's money through the International Credit Bank of Geneva, which he owned. Journalist Ed Reed said that Lansky's sexual blackmail operations would start back as far as 1939. Ed Reed wrote a biography of a woman named Virginia Hill and says that Virginia Hill was sent by Lansky to Mexico to seduce, quote, top politicians, army officers, diplomats, and police officials, end quote. And that this was all connected to a drug ring that would involve the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA. And this would not be Lansky's last foray into the world of sexual blackmail. A former Lansky associate said that Lansky had obtained photos of FBI Director Hoover in some kind of gay situation. These photos showed him having some sort of sexual activity with his deputy director Clyde Tolson, and these compromising photographs eventually fell into the possession of CIA counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton. BBC journalist Anthony Summers said that it was actually William Donovan, the director of the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, who had initially obtained these photographs and shared them with Lansky. And this makes us ask a number of questions. What kind of relationship did Mayor Lansky have with William Donovan, a high-level intelligence operative? And what kind of relationship did he have with CIA counterintelligence chief James J. Angleton, another high-level intelligence operative? And were these relationships that Mayor Lansky had with intelligence based on sharing blackmail material with one another? Another question that this makes us ask is, where were these photographs of Hoover taking place? Could it have been at one of Rosensteel's parties where Hoover had been seen going in and out of from the 50s and the 60s? And we know that Rosensteel and Hoover had a very close relationship where they would send flowers to one another, and that Rosensteel even donated over $1 million to the J. Edgar Hoover Foundation. And this brings us to the final figure in Rosensteel's sexual blackmail operation, and that is none other than Roy Cohn. While Cohn is today mostly known for his role as Donald Trump's mentor, he got his start early at the age of 23 in the highly publicized trial of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And it was also around this time that he began to cultivate a close relationship with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, supposedly in their shared interest of anti-communism. After the trial of the Rosenbergs, Cohn would go on to become part of Joseph McCarthy's council until he attempted to blackmail the army into giving his rumored homosexual lover David Shine preferential treatment. And because you don't go blackmailing the damn army, he was told to leave the council, and it wasn't long after he left the council that he was hired by the Sachs, Bacon, and O'Shea law firm, where he would bring in a litany of mafia clients, including none other than Louis Rosensteel. Cohn and Rosensteel would have a very close relationship with one another, and often their relationship was compared to that of a father and a son. Life magazine said that Cohn would refer to Rosensteel as the Supreme Commander, and that Rosensteel would refer to Cohn as the Field Commander. And it is very interesting that Supreme Commander is also something that Mayor Lansky would call Rosensteel. So are these just playful nicknames, or does this denote their rank in a sexual blackmail operation, an underage sexual blackmail operation that these individuals were running, instead of just cutesy little nicknames? Now let's backtrack just a little bit to Rosensteel's fourth ex-wife, Susan Kaufman. One of the parties that Susan Kaufman claimed to attend was a party held by Roy Cohn in 1958 at Manhattan's Plaza Hotel in Suite 233. She said that there she was introduced to Hoover, who was wearing drag, and that also present were Cohn and Rosensteel, and that all three had sexual activities with underage boys at this party. New York attorney John Klotz also found evidence of the sexual blackmail ring operating out of Suite 233 in the Manhattan Plaza Hotel. Klotz told a journalist, "Roy Cohn was providing protection. There were a bunch of pedophiles involved. That's where Cohn got his power from. Blackmail." Former NYPD detective and head of the Department of Human Trafficking Vice-Related Crimes Division, James Rothstein, told John DeCamp, the former Nebraska senator who exposed a different child sex ring operating out of Omaha involving high-level Republican politicians, had told DeCamp that Cohn had admitted his role in the operation during a sit-down interview. Rothstein told DeCamp, Cohn's job was to run little boys. Say you had an admiral, a general, a congressman who did not want to go along with the program. Cohn's job was to set them up, and then they would go along. Cohn told me that himself. Trump would buy the Manhattan Plaza Hotel where Cohn had held his sex parties in the year 1986, not long after Cohn's death from AIDS. Trump would go on to throw parties in these suites at the hotel where attendees said that young women and girls were introduced to older, rich men. Illegal drugs and young women were passed around and used. A male model who'd helped organize these parties said, a lot of girls 14 look 24. That's just as juicy as I can get. I never asked how old they were. I just partook. Cohn would go on to forge many relationships with powerful and influential people throughout his life. He had friends who were high up in the media, like Rupert Murdoch and Barbara Walters. He had powerful legal friends like Alan Dershowitz. And he even had friends in the White House, such as Ronald and Nancy Reagan. He also had many friends in the intelligence agencies, one of whom was CIA Director William Casey. And Roy Cohn was not the only guy who was helping to run sexual blackmail operations that William Casey knew. Another one of these men that Casey knew was Robert Keith Gray, the former CEO of the DC PR firm Hill & Knowlton. According to the Post, he was one of the most sought-after lobbyists in Washington. He was also a GOP fundraiser and an advisor to both Eisenhower and Nixon. He served as the deputy director of communications during Reagan's campaign, which put him working directly beneath William Casey before he took his post as the CIA director. Among Keith's PR clients were people who will come up later in this series, such as Saudi arms dealer Adnan Khashoggi and Mark Rich, a Mossad intelligence asset with ties to what would become the Epstein Network. After Rich was imprisoned for tax evasion and illegal business dealings in Iran, Bill Clinton pardoned Rich at the behest of none other than the Israeli intelligence head and Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who you can see palling around with Epstein, and mega group member Michael Steinhardt. Nebraska Senator DeCamp said that Gray was a specialist in homosexual blackmail rings for the CIA, and that Cohn had been reported to be involved in Gray's operation. Gray is known to have palled around with CIA agent and naval intelligence officer Edwin Wilson. According to Wilson's former partner Frank Turple, historically, one of Wilson's agency jobs was to subvert members of both houses. DeCamp said that Gray's operation was an offshoot of the MacArthur-era blackmail operations which Roy Cohn was a part of. Now let's talk a little bit about the DC lobbyist Craig Spence, a man who, like Epstein, had massive amounts of wealth that really couldn't be accounted for. He was exposed by the Washington Times for his involvement with homosexual prostitution rings. The Times report says that Spence often boasted that he was working for the CIA, and on one occasion that he said that he was going to disappear for a while because he had an important CIA assignment, and that he also worried that the CIA might double-cross him and kill him and make it look like a suicide. The report also claims that Spence had spoken of smuggling cocaine from El Salvador into the United States. Spence had even toured the White House with his call boys during Bush Sr.'s presidency, and Spence would go on to say that it was National Security Advisor Donald Gregg who had granted him access to the White House. Gregg had worked under William Casey in the CIA prior to his post in the NSA. Gregg also worked with William Barr to stonewall the Pike and Church Congressional Committee that were investigating CIA malfeasance, including their honeypot operations. This is the same William Barr who is the current Attorney General, and the same William Barr whose dad, Donald Barr, got Jeffrey Epstein the job at the Dalton School despite the fact that he had no qualifications. That's the same Donald Barr who wrote the book Space Relations, which is literally about child sex trafficking in space, in case you wanted to go check that out. That's the name of it, Space Relations. But anyways, yes, that is Williams Barr's connection to Donald Gregg and all that. But the Times report also states that he had close ties to none other than Roy Cohn, and that Spence had thrown Roy Cohn a birthday party, and that none other than the CIA director William Casey attended. After Spence's callboy ring was exposed, it wasn't long before the revelation of the Franklin child sex trafficking and ritual murder scandal broke. The operation was ran by prominent GOP lobbyist Larry King, who ran the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. The Omaha World Herald said that money from the credit union somehow found its way into the Nicaraguan Contra rebels. And an investigative journalist told DeCamp, "The way we discovered King and his Nebraska-based callboy ring was by looking through the credit card chits of Spence's ring, where we found King's name." DeCamp figured out that these child sex rings ran by King and Spence operated under a larger network known as Bodies by God. While not much is known of this larger network, we know that Spence and King were connected to it, and that the two of them were connected to many in the Reagan and Bush Sr. administration, as well as those in intelligence and Roy Cohn's network. And Spence was allegedly directly connected to Roy Cohn. And not long before his supposed suicide, Craig Spence told the Washington Times reporters who initially broke the story, "All this stuff you've uncovered, to be honest with you, is insignificant compared to other things I've done. But I'm not going to tell you those things, and somehow the world will go on." Well, guys, that's the video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you can see why all of the information is relevant, because literally, here's just one example of how this information is all relevant to what would go on to be the Epstein Network. Samuel Bronfman, who was mentioned towards the beginning of the video, his son, Charles Bronfman, would go on to be the co-founder of the Mega Group with Leslie Wexner. And Leslie Wexner, as you guys most likely know, is the financial backer behind Jeffrey Epstein. So there is a literal example of how this is kind of a continuation of a network that existed before when we were talking about Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And actually, one of Bronfman, Samuel Bronfman's grandchildren, also was involved with the Nexium sex cult, which would use blackmail and sexual blackmail. So yes, this is all just a continuation of a network that's existed for a long time. Now, I got the information for today's episode from 2 Whitney Webb articles, the first 2 in a 4-part series about the Epstein Network. I encourage you guys to go look at those 2 articles if you have any questions about what was in today's video, and just to read the whole series if you are interested in the Epstein scandal, because it is just phenomenal research, and it's where I am getting a lot of the information that I am talking about. But anyways, I will link to those 2 articles by Whitney Webb, and I strongly encourage you guys to go check those out. And I'm also going to link to a Band Discovery Channel documentary that never aired that was about the Franklin scandal. And I also encourage you guys, which I'll probably do a video about the Franklin scandal in the future, and go over a lot of the things that John DeCamp talks about in the Franklin cover-up book that he wrote, and also go over some of the other connections that were put together by Nick Bryant, who just wrote a book called Just the Franklin Scandal. So yeah, that'll be sometime in the distant future. But anyways, for the time being, I'm going to link to the Franklin cover-up documentary in the description below, and I advise you go look at that too if you want to figure out about just insanely evil people like Lawrence King, and all that. So anyways, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If you like it, let me know in the comments below. If you hate it and you hate me, let me know in the comments below, and I'll get back to you either way probably. So anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed that video, and I hope you guys have a good day.